We're all aware of the opioid crisis ravaging our country. But while we've been preoccupied with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's only gotten worse.
Well, a tragic milestone now. More than 100,000 people dead from drug overdoses in a single year.
It's up nearly 30% from the previous 12 months. It's twice as many people who died from overdoses just in 2015. According to the New York Times, it's more than the total of car crashes and gun fatalities combined. Most of the deaths were caused by opioids and fentanyl in particular.
Healthcare professionals, social scientists, and policymakers have been desperately searching for a way to cure this epidemic for decades.
When I started working with this, you would give talks and you say, 30,000 people died. And then these numbers keep going up. And now we're in numbers that essentially pass like cancer, pass certain type of death toll that we know for other disease.
That's Marco Pravetoni, a professor at the University of Washington, where he leads the Center for Medication Development for Substance Use Disorders.
This is not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. And as we saw with the COVID vaccine, the more investment that you put into a public health problem, the faster you'll find a solution.
And that's Sandra, a professor at Columbia University, where she directs the Opioid Laboratory.
I think these drugs are so powerful because they target so many processes that are difficult to separate the good from the bad. That's why it's also tricky, to treat or prevent addiction.
But after years of half measures and trade-offs, Pravetoni may have finally discovered what could be the ultimate weapon for defeating the epidemic. He's developed the very first opioid addiction vaccine, and Comer is currently testing the vaccine in clinical trials.
I think it's a strategy to help them get over or at least stop using the opioids. It's a long journey to recovery, and I think this is one tool that they can use along the way.
From the University of Chicago Podcast Network, this is Big Brains, a podcast about the pioneering research and pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. On this episode, a vaccine for opioid addiction. I'm your host, Paul Rand. It seems like shows about the prevalence of opioids are everywhere these days. There's the hit HBO TV show Euphoria, the award-winning Hulu miniseries Dopesick, and the crime drama Hightown. But rarely do we get a glimpse into the scientific nature of what opioids do to the brain.
The opioid receptor system is so embedded in how human beings and mammals evolve, and so they're an integral part of our physiology and pharmacology. And normally opioids, they are very small molecules, and usually after being either injected or snorted or inhaled, the opioid molecules will actually cross the blood-brain barrier, reach the brain, where they will target the opioid receptors.
And there are 4 main opioid receptors:
mu, delta, kappa, and nociceptin, but the one that most people are familiar with is the mu opioid receptor. Heroin and oxycodone and fentanyl all produce their euphoric effects through the mu opioid receptor.
Once scientists identified the mu opioid receptor, they were able to develop medications that targeted it as a way to treat opioid use disorder.
So the 3 medications that are approved include methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. So methadone is a full mu agonist. It binds to that receptor and turns it on. If you've been taking methadone for a certain amount of time, if you use heroin on top of that, you won't feel the effects of the heroin. Buprenorphine is a partial agonist, so it also binds to the mu opioid receptor, but it doesn't turn it on quite as strongly as methadone does. With naltrexone, it also binds to the mu opioid receptor, but unlike buprenorphine and methadone, once it binds there, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't turn it on. It just blocks other drugs like heroin and fentanyl and oxycodone from actually getting to the receptor to produce euphoria.
But if we have these medications, why is the problem just getting worse and worse?
We're really happy that we have these 3 medications, but they're all, also associated with, some drawbacks. With naltrexone, for example, people who are opioid dependent have to be completely detoxed, tapered off of the heroin or the fentanyl before they can be started on the naltrexone. Methadone, you have to be really careful in the way a clinician does in the way it's used, because it can cause respiratory depression on its own. Sometimes there's diversion of methadone for illicit use. With buprenorphine, it's also a little bit tricky to get on it because you don't have to detox somebody completely off of heroin in order to start buprenorphine. You have to use it carefully because otherwise it can precipitate pretty severe withdrawal. We're really grateful that we have these medications. The problem, though, is that the research has shown that once a patient starts on any of these three medications, after about 6 months in treatment, about half of the patients will relapse to heroin or fentanyl use.
The stigma of opioid addiction has also affected the availability of these drugs.
A lot of these drugs like methadone and buprenorphine, often there is some stigma about the fact that these are potential agonists that, take one drug away from the other, but essentially are still on drugs. But if you think about a safely prescribed medications that doesn't involve, let's say, intravenous use, so will decrease exposure to bloodborne pathogens such as HIV, such as hepatitis.
I think actually this is one of the things that is somewhat unique to the U.S. feeling about how to treat people with opioid use disorder, because like in Europe, for example, it's the thinking is you can maintain somebody on methadone or buprenorphine or naltrexone for their entire life, and it's just a long-term sort of treatment. Whereas here in the U.S., the insurance companies will only pay for short periods of time. So all of these approaches have their kind of challenges, which is one of the things that I think led Dr. Pravetoni to develop this vaccine approach.
Vaccine has become a powerful word these days.
People talk about vaccines these days, especially with COVID. But vaccines are typically used for infectious disease. But what vaccines are really becoming, especially in the last decade or so, are becoming this type of flexible intervention that could be used beyond infectious disease.
We recently heard an example of this on our episode about a vaccine for cancer.
And one specific use of vaccines is actually targeting drugs abuse.
The vaccines against COVID have been highly effective at reducing mortality. Could an opioid vaccine do the same for this epidemic?
These vaccines are designed to stimulate the immune system, just like any other vaccine. The body can produce antibodies that are targeting, and they're very selective for the opioid of interest.
So the antibodies will go after opioid molecules as they make their way to try and connect with the mu receptor.
The antibodies will prevent that by binding the opioid, and the opioid, once it's bound to the antibody, because it becomes too big of a complex, won't pass through the blood-brain barrier, and so the vaccine would reduce the dose of opioids to get to the brain, and so would reduce the amount of drug that can actually elicit a pharmacological action. Once the antibody bounds to that opioid, the opioid is no longer able to bind any receptors. So it's kind of like a sponge that sort of mop up all the free circulating opioids.
The way this works is in essence, you're putting, maybe to visualize it, a bit of a shield around the brain. And that in some ways means that they're not going to be able to get the high.
Yeah, that's correct. Like you're putting a shield around the brain, so there is not enough drug that gets to the brain. And so the drug won't trigger any high, as well as other pharmacological effects of opioids.
No connection, no high, and no addiction. Amazingly, it gets even better.
We see specifically in animal models that these vaccines prevent opioid-induced respiratory depression and some cardiovascular aspects. Specifically for respiratory depression, that's one of the main aspect of overdose. Most people die of overdose because of respiratory depression and other complications.
When someone overdoses on opioids, if they're helped early enough, they can potentially be saved from dying with a medication called naloxone, also known as Narcan. But the fact that this vaccine would stop overdoses to begin with is a huge step forward. Even when we can save people with Narcan, overdosing has lingering effects.
It's not uncommon for us to see people who have overdosed 5, 6, 7 times. And each time that they overdose, the respiration is suppressed pretty severely in a lot of cases. And so there's not enough oxygen that gets to the brain. So it's called a hypoxic state. And when there's not enough oxygen that is in the brain for, just even a couple of minutes, you can produce, damage to the brain that can lead to cognitive impairment.
And so if you can prevent that, that's the main benefit of the vaccine.
And it sounds like the vaccine has to be done specifically to the opioid. So you're starting, if I'm getting this right, Sandy, you're starting with oxycodone. Is that right?
Yes. The vaccine is pretty selective in targeting a particular chemical structure. And oxycodone structure looks different than heroin, which looks different than fentanyl. We decided to start with oxycodone because at the time, that was the most widely used opioid, numbers-wise. We also have in development a heroin vaccine and a fentanyl vaccine. And the idea is that we will develop this vaccine that will target, all three of these different types of structures.
Okay, so we don't have any idea yet how long this immunity is going to last, though, do we? Because we've all gotten used to now we have to run to CVS every 6 months to update our COVID shots. Is there any indication at all? Is this going to be longer term? Or Sandy, you're smiling. I wonder what your thoughts are here.
We're hoping that it'll provide long-lasting antibody levels. So yeah, we're hopeful. Another thing that I think is really, really interesting is that because it's so selective in targeting, the fentanyl or oxycodone or heroin, it should not produce a lot of any cross reactivity with the existing treatment medications, methadone, naltrexone, or buprenorphine. So a patient could be on any of those medications and get vaccinated. And, clinically, the thing that's really exciting is that if it turns out that this, vaccine is very long lasting, I mentioned earlier, about 50% of patients will relapse after about 6 months, right? So if this vaccine lasts longer than that, and these patients have already been vaccinated, they relapse to heroin, fentanyl use after 6 months. If the vaccine is still producing these antibodies, at the very least, it could prevent them from overdosing, after they've relapsed. And it could also provide them an opportunity to be re-engaged in treatment.
We could also think of this vaccine in the usual way that we think of other vaccines, as a preventative rather than a treatment.
I think that's another thing that's really exciting about this approach is that, you could theoretically use it for someone you think might be at high risk, like a patient who's receiving opioids for pain or somebody who has other known risk factors for developing the disorder.
Basically stop someone from ever becoming addicted in the first place.
Yes, this is potentially something that can be used in that context. It also has the potential use in first responders, right? So people who in their line of work, like a police officer or, an EMT or somebody who, goes to a site where, drugs are there. And, we've heard stories in the news of, a police officer overdosing on fentanyl because it flew up in the air when they were trying to confiscate it. So, or in a mass casualty situation, I know the Department of Defense is looking at some of these things too, because you can aerosolize fentanyl and carfentanil, so in a military situation, you can, vaccinate people and prevent them from overdosing too. So there are these really interesting kind of applications of this approach.
Obviously, this vaccine is an incredible development in the battle against the opioid epidemic, but it also raises many questions. Will people actually want this vaccine? Who will have access to it? And how is the clinical trial going? Those questions after the break. Should they stay or should they go? When investors want to drive corporate social and environmental impact, is it best to influence from within or sell their holdings? Join Chicago Booth's Marian Bertrand from the Restandi Center for Social Sector Innovation and Luigi Zingalis from the Stiegler Center for the Study of the Economy and the State for a virtual session on how ESG investors can promote change. March 28th. Register at chicagobooth.edu/unpackingESG. The opioid addiction vaccine is an exciting development and has worked exceedingly well in trials in mice, and they're currently putting it to the test in humans by running a stage 1 clinical trial. So, how's it going?
Well, things are going well. I would say we are not really at liberty of discussing the data in the sense that the phase 1 clinical trial is a placebo control double blind. And so me and Dr. Comer are not privy of who is who and who's receiving what. But so far, we didn't see any adverse reactions. Some folks develop antibodies. And so we are seeing as things proceed that are as expected.
To answer the question of how are things going so far, I guess my answer would be so far, so good.
Assuming everything continues going well, it may be tempting to see this vaccine as a cure for the opioid epidemic, but there are still huge challenges. For one, it's not obvious that we should assume people will want it.
Would patients accept it?
So here's the question. If they know that there is a block to a certain one of the opioids, even if they're vaccinated against, the natural reaction, I would imagine, for anybody that is indeed addicted to a substance is to go find another substance that would work, possibly something even more dangerous. Does that foster into some of this difficult thinking and challenging questions that you're coming up against?
This question also applied to naltrexone, the opiate blocker. I was involved in some of the early development of these sustained release formulations of naltrexone. So you get it as a single shot that, slowly releases in the body over the course of about a month. And the same kind of worry was present there. It's just like, okay, you're blocking all of the opioid receptors. People are not going to be able to get high from heroin or oxycodone or fentanyl. Are they just going to shift to using something else? What we saw in the clinical trials that we ran with this, sustained release naltrexone was that when we gave it to, people who are primary opioid users, so they opioid use disorder was their primary disorder. They sometimes use cocaine and, use other drugs as well. And so, that was the worry is that, well, maybe they'll just shift to using cocaine or something else, alcohol. That happens occasionally, but in our clinical trial, what we found was that when we targeted their opioid use disorder, use of the other drugs went down as well.
Interesting. Why is that?
I think it's partly because, this is their main drug of choice. And when they, don't get it, then they're like, okay, I'm just going to stop. And, they develop a therapeutic relationship with their clinicians, right? And so once you engage them in treatment, then I think, you can really do a lot of good things for patients.
The thing I would also wonder about is that people would just simply up the dosage that they're taking to try to see if that helps, and thereby actually maybe making it even more dangerous. Is that occurring or not necessarily?
But what you're asking about is, why won't somebody just buy a lot more heroin and then overdose on that? So, I think the thing that a lot of people don't recognize is that opioid users follow the same sorts of economic kind of, behaviors as anybody else. So they're not going to spend, $100, $150, $200 on a single hit of heroin that's not going to give them a very good high. So we didn't see that very often. I mean, naltrexone sustained release is used nowadays, and we don't really see that much.
There are also economic questions around the vaccine. Will it even be affordable for the people who need it most?
I don't think the vaccine will ever be free. Any vaccine, like even the ones that are administered through the regular public health, somebody is got to pay them. And so whether it's like through insurance or through occupation or employer, that will be something to be determined. As far as price of the vaccine, like I have to be honest and say we have no idea. We explore, this space. Obviously, there are other vaccines for other indication, but there is no biologics approved for addiction or nothing like close enough that you could actually make some sort of guesstimate. Would this be something that is reimbursed to the insurance? Would be something that is covered by rehab programs, and who should get the vaccine, who shouldn't, and how to essentially deal with that aspect.
Okay. Well, one of the things, and Marco, maybe I can swing this back to you. We were all stunned when we saw how quickly, even though there was a long ramp up, how quickly a COVID vaccine came to market. In this country, opioid deaths and problems and addictions have been headline news forever. We're now in deep parts of the legal settlements of this. I've seen the numbers associated with the work that you guys are doing. This is not an inexpensive type of proposition that you're going after. Are we putting the same amount of energy into solving the opioid crisis and the addiction issue and the potential vaccine as you think we ought to be, given what you've seen happen in other areas?
Well, the COVID-19 vaccine program, definitely bring reality and the things that can be done when different stakeholders put things together. So I would say that, in the addiction field, I would say the government, specifically NIH, put a lot of efforts in terms of providing people like me and Sandy enough dollars essentially to actually conduct the research. What we didn't see yet is that industry, public-private partnership that happened with COVID vaccines. So during COVID, academic groups or small biotechs that they had access to their own funding through federal programs, and then essentially they quickly partner up with pharma, and that accelerate the whole process because one is obviously budget to support the R&D research. Two is actually having the structure in place. So if you want to quickly manufacture a lot of doses, it's not something that you can do in academia or nor something that you can do with a federal grant. So for example, our grants are pretty substantial as academic go, but they pale in comparison what you would have, let's say, if GSK is coming in and say, hey, we want 1,000 doses tomorrow, they would add a couple of zeros to our budget, and that would actually make things feasible.
And creating that infrastructure between addiction treatment and our private and public health systems could serve us beyond just the opioid crisis. If this vaccine continues to work well, we could conceive of vaccines for all sorts of addictive substances.
So we are expanding the concept of multivalent. So for example, now we are doing just in mouse and rat studies, so very early stage, we are doing multivalent vaccines where we are targeting heroin, fentanyl, carfentanil, oxycodone, methamphetamine, and cocaine. And so that potentially we could think about a pentavalent, hexavalent, and so may not be a reality now, or let's say 3 years from now, maybe it takes 5 or 10 years, we generate enough preclinical data to support evidence that this approach is both safe, effective, and selective that will keep triggering and keeping this momentum. Or for instance, the infrastructure that we build to bring to the FDA approval in phase 1 clinical trial can be used for other approaches. That's also a positive outcome. So for example, we are working on monoclonal antibodies to reverse or prevent overdose, and the fact that we sit on a decade of research on biologics that enable developing all the science, all the regulatory aspects that will support development of other drugs in this class.
If you're getting a lot out of the important research shared on Big Brains, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should check out. It's called Not Another Politics Podcast. Not Another Politics Podcast provides a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories, not through opinions and anecdotes, but through rigorous scholarship, massive data sets, and a deep knowledge of theory. If you want to understand the political science behind the political headlines, then listen to Not Another Politics Podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network.
Big Brains is a production of the UChicago Podcast Network. If you like what you heard, please give us a review and a rating. The show is hosted by Paul M. Rand and produced by me, Matt Hodap, with assistance from Alyssa Eads. Thanks for listening.